All right, it's 12 o'clock. I'm going to start the recording. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Welcome to Coaching Agile Journeys. We started about 3 years ago. You can see our co-hosts there, wave your arms, and some of us had backgrounds. We just came together to continue learning, growing, and helping others, and then we became passionate around helping others also because we were just finding really great topics that we wanted to share with other people. And along the way, we found the open movement. And if you're interested in the Open Leadership Network, just go to openleadershipnetwork.com. We had the first Open Leadership Symposium last week in Boston, and it was really amazing. There's lots of information on that site. We'd love for you to register for our events and follow us on Coaching Agile Journeys. All of our past events are actually on our website. Follow us on Twitter. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Here are all our Twitter names. We love our volunteers and co-hosts in our community. So we've really become a big community. And what makes me happy about this is we see the same people join time after time. And so that tells me that our message is resonating. So here are our lovely co-hosts. You'll see our faces here and on Twitter and on LinkedIn. So please connect with us and tell us if you liked our topics. We'd love to know if our topics are resonating. And we do all of this in our own time and money. So please feel free to support us if you feel like we've made a difference in your life. Costs about $500 a year to run these events. So if everyone gave just $1 a year, we cover our expenses. That amounts to like less than $1 each time. And because of the amazing response to our Coaching Agile Journeys topics and monthly events, we added on our podcast, which we were having so many questions that went unanswered and we wanted to give back. So check out our podcast, curated by Jeff Kors, and it's available on all the popular platforms, so follow that. We love feedback on our podcast content as well. And as we talked about a little earlier, if you missed it, we are going to welcome John Cutler next. I'm so excited. He's going to have just an open Q&A on product development. So I'll ping a link with the questions that we want to queue up for him. You'll see that on Twitter. So if you follow us on Twitter, you can have an opportunity to contribute to the topics that he talks about. So we'll be sharing that on Twitter after this. And I just want to say, Colleen, thank you so much for joining today. I'm so excited that you're here. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And your contributions to the Agile community have not gone unnoticed. And we saw your talk, and we just thought, what a great thing for you to be able to come on here. So thank you so much for accepting. We're so excited you're here. We want to know why WIP matters.
Great. All right. Should I go ahead and switch gears here? All right. Well, thank you so much for the invitation to join this group. It is an honor to be here and be here presenting. This is such a cool format and such a great way to bring the coaching community together. So thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. So we're going to kick things off here with why WIP matters. Let me make sure I've got, okay. So my name is Colleen Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at ScrumHive. I have been the director of the Adaptive Agile practice at ImagineX Consulting for the last 3 years. I'm also a Lean Kanban accredited trainer and a Kanban coaching professional. I've been involved heavily with the local Agile Denver board of directors and been a co-chair for our amazing Mile High Agile Conference here for 2006 and 2017. I'm currently on the board of directors for Agile Uprising, and I am the CEO and founder of ScatterSpoke, which is a space for more effective team retrospectives. And then my most important job is mama to these 3 amazing kiddos. They are 1, 9, and 11, so we're always on the go. And I always like to start by sharing this information about myself, not so that I can convince you of my credentials, but so that I can also show you that I have... so that I can show you I have a hard time saying no to things. I have a tendency to overcommit. I get excited about things, and I'm not great at managing my own WIP limits. So as we go through this, I'll share some examples from real life, and I'm going to try to make this fun and memorable so that when you see these things come up in your everyday life, that you can think about why paying attention to how many things you have in progress is so important. So what is WIP? When I say WIP, I'm I am thinking of our work that's in progress. So basically any work that's started that hasn't been delivered to the customer yet. So we'll talk about a couple different examples. I know there are different variations of what WIP means, and this is the definition we're going to use for today. So anything that's in progress. This is another way to think of it. So look at all the stuff that we've started, all these half-finished projects lying around. I think everybody can probably relate to this. I certainly can in my home life, even outside of work. I love to craft and I can't tell you, there's a running joke in my house about buying fabric for sewing projects that are not complete, or yarn for knitting projects that are not complete. So I have a tendency to get excited, start these projects, and then never get them anywhere. So that's another example of all of our half-finished projects lying around are work in progress that has not delivered value yet. I don't have the hat or the scarf set that I started in 2007. So let's talk about why we should limit our WIP. There's only one of us, right? So our capacity is limited, and it's limited not just as an individual, but it's limited as a team and an organization. There's only so much that we can produce, regardless of how much caffeine we consume, or Diet Coke, whatever is your caffeine of choice. There's only so much you can produce, and our capacity of what we can do is limited. So we look to creating limits on how much work is in progress that match up with how much capacity that we have. But we suck at it, right? I think I just shared some examples in my life of my excitement for crafting and ability to overcommit there, but we suck at this at work too. We don't want to say no to new things coming up. There's a need for a lot of us to stay busy, to feel busy. That makes us feel productive. It makes us feel important and valuable. Everything that comes to us can often be perceived as a top priority. One of the things I see a lot, and I'm sure everyone can relate to, is having more than one number one priority or more than one queue of work that we're pulling from, right? We have our sprint commitment, and then we might have urgent issues or things that are just not tracked in the sprint, and where all of a sudden we're dealing with 4 or 5 number one priority items. There's always unplanned work that comes up. So while we've made commitments to work, there's things coming to us that are not planned or not tracked. And I mentioned that last one there, that we just feel like we have to stay busy to stay productive. And this isn't just something that we typically feel personally. It can be something that is a cultural environment of where we work. And you can see this sometimes with the need to have a lot of management intervention to make sure that everybody is 100% utilized, right? I think we've probably all seen that capacity spreadsheet, right? Of is everybody full? Does everybody have enough work? So what we're trying to do here with our WIP is really focus on what's a realistic amount of work that still allows us to respond to these things in a way that's not creating panic or overburdening. So this quote really resonated with me just in a lot of our environments, that we have a tendency to really focus on being busy when we should be focusing on being productive. And so doing one thing well, getting it all the way to done before we start the next thing, and rather than starting, right? So we'll talk about a couple different examples of how having a lot of things in progress isn't really making you more productive or more effective. So I want to start here with just a really quick overview of what is a pull system. And I think that understanding a pull system is going to be important for kind of the context for this conversation. So this, what you're looking at, is a typical view of a Kanban board. And across the top here, each of the stages of my workflow have a work in progress limit or a WIP limit. So to do has a WIP of 2, Deb has a WIP of 3, code review has a WIP of 1, and so on. And in a pull system, we are basically saying, I'm not going to push work downstream. So if this gray card is complete, I would not be able to move it into code review because code review is already at a WIP of 1, so it's full. So think of your WIP limit as a signal of your capacity to do something new. So that gray card would actually stay in the development column until there was space or capacity in code review to pull it in. This does actually mean that development has to stop working. I know that's often one of the hardest concepts around a pull, because everybody panics that now we have somebody sitting idle, and I'll address that again here as we move through some of these concepts in more detail. So what we would do in this situation, and this comes from manufacturing, is we would stop the line and say, we're not going to continue to work in the development column and create a pile of growing work that nobody can keep up with. We're going to have everybody address the code review card, and so we can move that card downstream and make space for the next card to move into code review. When we think about how this system works, we want to think about arrivals and departures. And I like to use the airport as an example. I travel a lot for work, and I'm sure everybody can relate to sitting on an airplane and then having, you board, you get all situated in your seat, and then they come on and tell you that you're going to have to sit on the runway. Or you land and they tell you you're going to have to sit on the plane because there is no gate available. When we think about this, this is an imbalance of arrivals and departures, right? So we want to be thinking about how do we balance out the amount of work coming into our system, or the planes landing on the runway with the planes leaving, so that there's always a gate available for them to pull into. And we do that through limiting our WIP as well. One of the things we want to think about is putting a WIP limit on our to-do column, and doing that allows us to force prioritization on work coming in, and also balance that with the amount of work leaving the system. So our goal here is that we're focusing all of our energy on moving all these items to done. So once that code review card is complete and can be pulled by QA, and we're making room for everything to be pulled downstream, then we have capacity then to prioritize the next item in the queue. So we're picking from our available options and then pulling something into that to-do column. This time that it takes for something to move from to-do to deploy is considered our cycle time. It can be anything on your Kanban board, so it's basically just from when it enters your system to when it leaves your system, and we'll talk about how cycle time becomes important here in a second. The minute we add a lot more work to this system without adding more capacity, so if we assume that this team stays the same size, but we increase the amount of our work in progress, it's just going to take longer for that card to move through that system. Now, there are, of course, ways to improve your capacity by adding more people or by changing the type of work that you're doing. But in the case where your team stays the same, we haven't added capacity, we've only added more work in progress. So that's going to contribute to a longer cycle time. I know you guys have Dan Vacanti coming on in the coming weeks, and he will dig into with much more detail around predictability and forecasting. But one of the things that's important in your system here, in a flow-based system, is that you can only have that predictability when WIP stays consistent. If it's moving up and down and your amount of work in progress changes a lot, you'll never have that consistent cycle time that you can use for forecasting. The other thing that you want to think about with your work in progress is work that is not on the board, that's hidden. And this is another thing that we see a lot in our teams. And my colleague, Janae McConnell, calls this ghost WIP. It's the stuff that nobody wants to put on the board, those little things that you think, well, it's just going to take me 2 hours, so I'm not going to track it. And we'll talk about the contribution that this has. But we want to get all of that work visible when we start thinking about our work in progress so that we can manage our work. So let's talk about why. Let's talk about why WIP is important and why we want to limit the amount of things that we have in progress. There's 4 things that we're going to focus on today. It is focus, first of all, bringing focus to our work, giving us flexibility, focusing on follow through and really getting that work to done. And the last one is the most important to me, it's sustainable pace. So let's go through these. So our first one is bringing focus. You've probably all heard that context switching can reduce your effectiveness by up to 20%. And that's when we're just talking about switching once. So think about what that does to your effectiveness when you're switching all day. This is in everything, right? You see this in moving from your phone to your laptop or going from meeting to meeting. all that context switching starts to pile up, and it starts to reduce the quality of what we're doing. So bringing focus to doing one thing at a time means that we're doing it with more attention and more and higher quality. It also helps with mastery because we're bringing that focus to what we're doing, especially when you think about this from a development and test perspective. And it reduces overburdening. And when we talk about overburdening, we mean that we're not going to have one person in our team that has a ton of work to do when the rest of the team is sitting idle. So this is bringing the whole team together to focus on one thing at a time. So work in progress limits help us manage priority. So I like to think about Thanksgiving Day when I think about this. So I love to cook, but I'm also vegetarian. So I host Thanksgiving a lot. And, you know, for a lot of households, you get up at 5 or 6 in the morning to get the turkey in the oven. You have one oven. So that is your constraint is your capacity, that you have one oven. Maybe you're lucky enough to have 2 ovens, but we'll go with one oven for this example. And you probably get up at 5 or 6 in the morning to put that turkey in the oven and start that process, because the turkey is the star of the show. Understanding your capacity and limiting how much work can go to your team forces you to make a decision about what is the highest priority. So it's really forcing decision making and bringing that focus to whatever is the highest priority. So in my house, we get up early and we start pie because we don't eat turkey. But so when you think about it from a team perspective, when we really focus on limiting our work in progress, it's driving that conversation around what is the highest priority item. And this means that we need one queue and one highest priority item. And by limiting the team's focus to those things, we're really driving that conversation around what is the most important thing for this team to do. The goal in that is that we're minimizing multitasking. So we're going to bring all of our focus to that one item as a team and getting that item all the way to done. So that's our first one. Focus. Think of the turkey. Focus is about saying no. I can't recommend Dominica DeGrandis's book enough. If you have not read that book, it is called Making Work Visible. And when I think about WIP limits, and I'm working with new teams that are trying to apply limits to their work in progress, I think this is one of the most important parts about empowering the team to say no. And for a lot of teams, I think WIP limits can feel a little like someone is telling you to do less work, right? And there's that's very unsettling for a lot of us. We feel like I can handle it. I can handle one more thing, or I can pick one more thing up. But our ability to focus on one thing at a time means that we have to say no to something else. And so WIP limits are really to enable the team to say no to that other thing, those one-off requests or those drive-by requests that come at you over the course of the day. All right, our next item is flexibility. So flexibility is important because it is, I mean, at its core, that's what we're trying to achieve with an Agile practice. We want to be able to change quickly and change direction on demand, whether that's from a priority perspective, from a technology perspective, or switching to a different epic. So that's what our goal is in an Agile system. But in order to do that, we can't have a lot of changes in flight. So if we have, if we have 30 stories that we've started at the beginning of a sprint, it becomes really hard to switch gears mid-sprint if that no longer becomes the priority. So reducing the amount of work that we're doing at any given time creates more opportunity to reprioritize as needed. It also helps us focus on just-in-time definition. And this is something that's super important for me. I really like to really bring a lot of focus to the ability to do that just-in-time definition by starting less work at once. And what I mean by that is if we're only working on 5 stories at a time and halfway through story number 3, we learn something different about the technology or the implementation details for that work, we can now go to stories 6, 7, and 8 and define them with that new piece of knowledge. So we've learned something new that we can incorporate into the stories. Rather than starting stories 1 through 10, with a limited amount of information. So we're kind of rolling through the definition cycle based on new learning, and doing less at once really enables that system. This also helps us facilitate urgent and unplanned work. And there's a lot of great material on Twitter about this recently, of how important slack time is, and having space in your system to absorb urgent or unplanned work. When everybody is utilized at 100% and something urgent comes up, we have to stop what we're doing to pick that up. And so part of what we're trying to do is create flexibility by having less work in progress. So I want to share an example with you from Costco. I don't know if you guys have seen this lovely snack. These are squeezy packs of chia seeds in blackberry flavored goo. They're pretty gross, and I took my kids to Costco, and they convinced me that they looked delicious and that we should buy a box of 80 of them. Well, I live in a house from the 1920s, so pantry space is very limited. And basically, I committed to this, and the minute the kids ate one, they were like, they are disgusting. So I overcommitted to an amount of inventory and was locked in now to this box that consumed a third of my pantry space and did not have the flexibility to switch to other snacks. You can imagine how much they loved that, right? You have to eat them all to make space for popcorn, or insert better yummy snack here. So WIP and putting limits on our WIP helps us manage our inventory. When we commit to too much, it creates inflexibility, and then we're stuck with something that we can't sell, or we can't move, or we can't change course. You see this a lot too with abandoned code mid-flight, so or thrown away snacks from my pantry. So think of this when you're, when you commit to doing too much work at once and starting too much, you've created an inventory problem. The other thing that's important when we think about inventory and WIP as inventory is that all of that is a cost to us at this point, where we haven't received a return on that cost because we haven't delivered anything yet. And I think when you think of starting work, it can feel like, well, if we start it all at once, we're being more efficient, but we haven't delivered anything yet. Where we were talking before we kicked this off about some of the games, like the air paper game, or the pennies game, or the ball game. And what you see is that slow trickle of work to done is starting to give you a return on value, versus sitting on a lot of inventory that hasn't delivered anything to the customers yet isn't giving you any value. So reducing the amount of inventory by limiting our WIP helps us minimize the pain of change. So if I had not been at Costco, for example, and had maybe bought a 4-pack of the chia squeezy packets, and then decided that no one in my family would eat them, I wouldn't have committed to so much inventory on my tiny pantry shelf. So think of this when you think of how much code you can have in flight at any given time. We want to reduce the amount of work that we're committing to and that we're working on and starting on, so that when we want to change direction, it's a lot easier on us.
Hey, Colleen, there's some great questionings happening in Slido right now.
Okay.
And one of them I think fits in with what you're talking about, so I'm interrupting. I hope that's okay.
Yeah.
What if a work item in progress is blocked, or there's a delay waiting? Can or should something else be pulled in until that item is ready to be worked again?
Yeah, this is a great question. So the answer is no. So you usually have your blocked items, even if it's waiting internal or external dependencies, they count towards your WIP limit for the column, or wherever in your value stream it gets blocked, it counts against the WIP limit there. The reason we keep it there and we keep it consuming that WIP is because it brings attention to that blocker and forces us to address it to make space for something new. I'm sure you can all relate to, as soon as you can work around it, we kind of push it out of the way and forget it, right? So if I had, let's go back to the Costco example, if I had a giant pantry and could move those gross chia packets out of the way to buy other snacks, I wouldn't have to deal with them, right? I wouldn't have to make a decision about priority or make a decision about switching gears. But what happens when the other piece of blockers is that when we work around them, we don't address the problem of what the root problem of the blocker. So by making blockers really painful and having to address them, even if it means we have to have the same conversation at stand up for 3 weeks, when we bubble that up, we're also helping bubble up a root cause of what's creating blockers for the team. And so I get that question quite frequently, and a lot of times the concern is, well, what will management think, right? If we tell them we can't start work because this item's blocked. Well, I guarantee you'll get management's attention on whatever's causing that blocker pretty quickly, and get to some resolution around the blockage, versus covering it up and continuing to work around it. And that's really what our goal is.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
That's, I think there's a couple more. I'll give you the next one that got voted up. I don't know if it really fits right here, but I will anyway, because it got voted up pretty high. Teams often freak out a little when starting to use WIP limits. Do you have any suggestions on how to help teams embrace it?
I do. So I try to work with the team to help them understand that this is for them. I'm not setting a WIP limit on them. I want them to set a WIP limit for themselves so that they have the ability to say no, they have the ability to focus, and that they can create a system that gives them a sustainable pace. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But I think the team has to understand that these limits are for them, not on them. It's a way for them to manage their work and just have a better, a happier path, a happier pace, and hopefully deal with change. As we're talking about changing gears here, I want that to be easy for them. So if the limits they've got feel too low, that it's so low that it's making them feel like they can't do enough work, then we'll move them up. I want the team to find the right limit for them. And I'll talk a little bit about how to set that here in a minute.
Awesome. All right, I'll let you keep going, and we'll hit you with some more questions in a little bit.
Okay.
Thanks.
So back to inventory. The more inventory a company has, the less likely they will have what they need because they've got too much in progress. All right. So our third benefit of limiting our WIP is in follow through. So blockers, we just spent some time talking about, and limiting the amount of work that we can have in progress at any given time helps us bring visibility to those blockers so that we have to address them. And that's by design. We want this to be painful so that we have to work to resolve those blockers before we start something else. This also helps us focus on shorter cycle times. So our goal here, and if you think back to that slide where we were talking about predictability in Little's Law, cycle time is a direct result of how much work you have in progress. And while you can't necessarily just will your work faster through the system, you can control your WIP limit. So that's the lever we have to pull when we think about how we can get work through our system faster. Having this third bullet here around regression testing, I think is such an important one for so many teams. When we have a lot of changes in progress, especially when we're running release trains or long-running release branches where we're maybe working in sprints, but we're building up a large amount of changes in this release that still have to go through regression testing at the end, we're kind of pushing a problem further and further out, and it's a growing problem, right? So by doing less at once, we're reducing the amount of testing like that has to come at the end. And then we're also trying to build in that slack time. So slack time, again, being not being utilized to 100%. We don't want our team at max capacity all the time. We want slack, and that does a lot of great things for the team. It creates the ability to respond to unplanned work. It creates some flexibility in terms of switching priorities when needed. It also, when we think of follow through and slack time together, one of the things that often happens, right, if we think about the board example I shared where development can't pull a new card because they're at capacity and code review is full. Having Slack means that rather than pulling something new in, I would work with my team to figure out how to move something else downstream. And so the conversation then becomes, how do I help get something done rather than how do I start something new? And that can be, that brings the team all together to focus on delivery as a group and as a unit, and swarm around their work so they're getting that stuff done. And slack time is a huge piece of having the ability to do that. So when I think about this ability to follow through, I think about the capacity that the team has, right? So we have to figure out what's the right amount of capacity for our team, and how do we show that we have capacity to do something new. You guys saw the picture. I have 3 kids. We have an IKEA here in Denver. It's a fairly new IKEA. And shopping with my kids at IKEA is probably one of my least favorite things on earth to do. They can touch everything, they can open everything, they can knock everything over, and they do, and they love it. There's a play place though at the entrance to IKEA. And IKEA has a very simple visual system for whether or not they have capacity for your child. They hang these orange construction vests right outside the play area. And there's a ratio, right, I think of 10 kids per adult. And so if there is space for your child to play and not go shopping with you, you pop a little vest on your kid and you check them in to play. So this is a visual system showing that the team has a visual system to show that there is capacity for another child to play. So limiting the amount of work that we have in our system creates pressure to complete something in order to create capacity for new work. So you can wait outside that play area for the vest to come out so that you can check your child in. But in our teams, what we're trying to do is show that by limiting how much work we have in our system, that we have to address that something needs to move out before something else can move in. And we do that by putting WIP limits in place to manage how much capacity that match up with how much capacity our team has. So our goal here is to minimize starting more work. So we don't want to just start work to feel busy. Back to this example, we want to figure out what can we do to get this card all the way to done. It might not even be that code review card, right? It could be jumping over and helping QA. So maybe as a group, we need to see if QA needs any assistance, and we can move one of their cards downstream to make room for all of our work to flow closer to done. So a lot of the stress that people feel doesn't come from having too much to do. It comes from not finishing what they've started. You'll see a lot of the talks that I do, I refer to this as piles, right? Nobody likes staring down a pile of work, unless it's a pile of money. But piles of laundry, piles of work, piles of bills. Most of the piles are not good piles. And that's because it stresses us out. It's this looming feeling that we're never going to be able to keep up or catch up. And that creates stress and tension in our teams. So let's talk about this last one here. And I think this is where that really comes up. When we think about sustainable pace, and part of what we're trying to do with our WIP limits is create a sustainable pace for the team. I see even in teams that do Scrum very well and are always ready to deliver something at the end of their sprint, that inside of their sprint, there's a little bit of an unsustainable pace where development might work for the first week and a half of the sprint and then deliver all the stories to QA with 3 days left. And then there's a pile, right, that QA has to try to keep up with and try to clean up to meet that sprint deliverable. And there's a lot of stress on both ends there. There's stress for the developers to get things to QA quickly enough to close them out. There's stress for QA now to be able to get through those stories in time for the demo and the close of the sprint. And so one of our goals in limiting our WIP is to reduce that variability of the amount of work coming to us at any given time, so that we're not stressing people out, that we have a predictable pace and a predictable cadence, and that there is no more burnout. I always like to share with everybody, I've been in software for 20 years now, and I've spent the first 10 years of my career in QA. And in a lot of waterfall projects where I would, 9 months out of the year, I was playing ping pong with most of the day and just waiting for the developers to finish. And then the last 3 months of the year, I wasn't sleeping and I was testing everything and panicking, trying to get something out the door to meet a deadline. And that pace just creates a lot of stress and friction where people get burned out and will leave, right? So our goal is to create a sustainable pace of work. When we think about how WIP limits help us do that, they manage cadence. So putting limits on our work in progress helps manage the cadence of how things move through our system. And you see this with Southwest Airlines. So the picture you're looking at here is the boarding signs for Southwest, where I'm sure you guys have all flown where it's everybody stand up and get in line, especially if you've flown any of the budget airlines in Europe, where it's just like everybody lines up as quick as they open the gate, and that's how you get your seat. And that's stressful, right? You don't know if you're going to get to sit together or with your family, with your kids. So no one wants the middle seat. But Southwest Airlines has created a way to limit the amount of people boarding at any given time in these groups of 30 so that they can manage the cadence of how people get on the plane. And it has created a much, as pleasant as it can be, I would say it's a much more pleasant experience for boarding the flight. So a consistent amount of work coming through that system reduces panic, stress, and the exhaustion created by trying to catch up. And our goal here is to minimize heroics. While I know there's a lot of people on the team that are willing to jump in and push things over the finish line, doing that over and over and over again will lead to burnout, and it can create mistakes in other places. So our goal is to just have a great pace for how work is moving through our system, so that nobody has to be the hero in getting something done. This is probably a good place to pause again, Kristen, if we've got any other questions you feel like are popping up.
We do. We have a few that have been voted pretty high. One of them, how do you address idle workers? Business is fast to criticize this seemingly counterintuitive notion.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the things I try to help teams with when they're first looking to introduce Slack into their system is, how long does it take us to respond to something? So looking at the time that when something is prioritized in the to-do column, how quickly can we pull it in? And obviously the shorter the better, especially if it's a critical issue. When our wait time from when something is prioritized to when something gets pulled to in progress is very high, that's an indication that we probably don't have enough Slack. So from a business perspective, I like to look at that as a responsiveness. With Slack in our system, we have the ability to be more responsive to things coming to the teams. And so if you can quantify that with some data, I think that's a great conversation starter for management or anybody who's pushing for 100% utilization.
Great, good one. Next one is, how would it work with external dependencies? For example, if we wait for external review for days, we'd block our work for something we don't have control over.
Yeah, and this is very common, and something that I think can be very, very powerful very early on in your system. So you would actually want to block your work, like you said, while waiting for those external dependencies, and again, measure how long they're taking. So if something's going to another team, a lot of times, once you start to track that and you can bring some visibility into the fact that, hey, you know, our work is blocked because we're at capacity waiting for your team to return something. First of all, it's escalating that problem, like we were talking about with blockers, and bringing visibility into the fact that your work is blocked. Then the other piece is measuring that. So being able to say that on average, let's say our cycle time on 85% of the time we can get a story done in 7 days. But of that 7 days, we usually spend about 3 days waiting for external teams. Then you have an area for that team to target in terms of improvement.
Yeah, and I think that's similar to that whole pull the cord, stop the line thing. Like, does it really need to take that many days, right? And if you don't bring the visibility, then nobody asks that question.
Exactly.
Cool. I'll give you one more. For teams working on complex products, developers often specialize in certain parts of the product. How can WIP limits work in such a scenario?
Definitely. I think they work well for those scenarios too. So in some cases, it's that each developer maybe has a column. I've seen developers do it by swim lane, but then you're looking more at WIP limits either by developer or by specialty, right? And depending on the tools you're using, even in an analog system, I think bringing limits, there's still only one person, right? Or there's still limited capacity for that area of specialty, whether it's a team or an individual. So it's, in some cases you could say it's even more important that you focus on limiting the work in progress for that person, because there's only, if there's only one mobile developer on the team, we need to separate out that capacity for that person so that they're not overburdened with all the requests coming in for mobile work. So in those cases, I usually create a separate WIP limit for in a swim lane or in a column for that person or their area of specialty.
Cool. Do you want to keep going, or do you want to take one more?
I'll keep going here, and then I'll
Sounds
pause
good.
again.
Perfect. Thanks.
All right, so we covered our 4 things. We had focus, follow through, flexibility, and sustainable pace. And so I said I would circle back to this. I think this is the question I hear most frequently is, what's the right number? And I'm going to give you the very consultant-y answer and say it depends. You want your starting WIP to be low enough to identify bottlenecks, right? And promote a smooth flow of work, but still high enough that it's not creating an artificial bottleneck on the team. Depending on who you ask, I feel like everyone has a different way that they like to start this. I have seen coaches who say, I double the number of people on the team, and that's the total system WIP, and I'll spread that out across phases. I know folks who will take things like area of specialty, like you just mentioned, Kristen, with that question of let's call out specialties and identify WIP by specialty. I've worked with other teams that have said, let's take the number of people on the team and subtract 1. So we always have space to respond to unplanned work or to pair. So there's a lot of different approaches here, but I think you have to start with what behavior are you trying to drive for your team. And then I think the important part here is that you have to approach this with some flexibility. So figure out what that starting number is. There is no right or wrong answer, but measure it and give yourself 2 weeks to measure your responsiveness to items in the to-do column, right? How long do things sit there before you have capacity to pull them in? What's your throughput look like? So how many items are leaving your system each week? Measure cycle time on all these items and look at blockers. So how long are things sitting blocked? Are they blocked internally or externally? What percentage of our overall time is work just waiting? That's referred to as flow efficiency, right? So if there's a lot of work in our system no one's touching it, it's just sitting there waiting for somebody else, we would have a very low flow efficiency number. So you want to pick a number that the whole team can agree to actually follow. I think that's the first step, and then measure it. And then I like to be very flexible with the teams for the first couple cycles of applying WIP limits to say, how did this feel, right? Did this feel like too much work, too little work? We can move this number up or down. As long as the team will agree to follow the WIP limits that you're setting, then you can do something with this data. So if I work with a team that says, we think it should be, every person should be able to have 2 things in progress at any given time, I will say, okay, do we expect that to improve the number, improve our cycle time and improve our throughput and decrease the amount of blockers? Then that's kind of our hypothesis. Let's put that in place and measure it for 2 weeks and then review it. And if we see that it's working, then great. If not, then let's potentially lower our WIP and then do the same thing. So I think that this is a little bit of trial and error, but your goal here is to focus on how do you still have enough work moving through your system that you're not creating a constraint, but that you're also forcing a focus on those bottlenecks and those blockers so that they get resolved quickly. I've been throwing around a lot of numbers here in terms of some of the metrics that you're looking at, but when you're playing with your cycle time, some of the metrics that you could look to are lead time. So that's how long does it take for us to pull it in? Cycle time, so the time it takes to move through your whole board. Throughput is just a simple count. I usually do throughput by week of how many items have moved through the system. When we talk about work in progress and work in progress limits, we tend to think of by column, but when we're looking at an entire system, we would consider our work in progress to be everything on that board. So including the to-do column, we're counting our total system WIP, and that's referred to as system WIP. And flow efficiency, I just mentioned, is that ratio between working time and cycle time that is a percentage of your total flow efficiency. So these are all some of the things that I would look to in coaching a team, and how are the WIP limits that are set in place, and what is the data telling me if that's an effective number for the team. So one of the things I want everybody to think about when we think about WIP limits is that it's not necessarily a limit, it's a go light. This is the airport. And one of the things that you are starting to see in a lot of places now is that they have this system that will tell you which space is open, right? So think of putting limits in your system and in your work and on your team as an ability to show a go light, that now I have the capacity to start something new. So rather than everybody pushing stuff to you and piling up or creating a long line of cars trying to find a spot in this row that maybe doesn't have any, we want to just show a go light saying, I'm ready to pull the next work item in. So think of your WIP limit as a go light rather than a stop light. And I like to always come back to how we work is just as important as how much we deliver. So I know with a lot of metrics and a lot of the things we're talking about here, we're trying to quantify our output, which is great. And I think having efficiency in your team and low cycle time is amazing. And I know that's always the goal for a lot of teams that are adopting a lot of these practices. But at the end of the day, how you're getting there is just as important. So we don't want to deliver more if it means we're going to burn everybody out and stress everybody out to get there. So our goal is to create that sustainable pace in how we're working so that we can deliver more, but do it with high quality and with happy people on our team. So that's everything I have. Let's dig back into these questions and see if anybody else has any other topics to cover.
Awesome. Awesome. So good. I love the go light. The go light's cool. All right. How do you recommend introducing the value of Slack time? I see the value, but how do I help leaders see it too when they're mainly watching the bottom line?
Yeah. I talked a little bit about that responsiveness. So being able to see how long it takes to respond to things. I also like to really focus in on, for teams where there's a high amount of unplanned work. So meaning basically anything with any kind of business urgency that's going to come to that team. Those are the teams where they need Slack the most. So that often will resonate with senior leadership to be able to say, you know, this team has, let's say they have typically between 6 and 8 critical issues that come to their team a week. And we need to have the ability to pick those up without planning. And one of the things that can be a powerful metric to share is when we stop working on something, how long does it sit for us to switch gears? And that can be as simple as saying, well, Kristen, you have ticket number 15 in progress, but you're going to stop to pick up this critical issue. So I'm going to track now from when you picked up this critical issue, how long did issue 15 sit in progress? Maybe it sat there for 3 or 4 days before you had a chance to come back to it or before somebody else on the team offered to pick it up. But now you can start to have a conversation around impact and the impact of stopping work on that ticket to pick up that other item because we did not, as a team, have enough slack in our system to be able to absorb that unplanned or critical issue.
Cool. Great answer. Next question. When asking the testers if they need help, I usually get, no, we're okay. Even if there's 20 items building up to test, how do we get team effort?
Yeah. So, and I see this across the whole system, right? Like I think that's awesome. They're offering to help. I've also had, I had a CTO tell me my developers will not test. That's not I don't hire them to test. I'm not going to ask them to test. Before I ever entered into the technology world, I worked in restaurants, and in the kitchens of all these restaurants, there's always a sign that says, if you can lean, you can clean. Meaning if there's no orders coming into the kitchen, find something else to do to contribute. And I like to use that with teams. So maybe you can't jump over and help test, or the testers don't want you to jump over and help test. But the goal here is that you're not contributing to a growing pile of work. So maybe it's unit tests, maybe it's documentation, maybe it's figuring out metrics and helping gather metrics so that we can address other problems in our system. But the number one thing I want the developers to focus on then in that case is not adding to a pile. Because then we'll never catch up, especially if the QA folks don't want help. So I always like to come back to that. Just don't add to the pile. Find some other way to contribute to the health of this team.
Great. How do you help how do you help teams figure out how to define their work into smaller units or reduce dependency? Many teams struggle with this in my experience. That's like a whole day's topic, but
it is.
But go for
and it's such an important one. You know, I think for a lot of us, teams at the team delivery level, we can have ironclad practices, right? Whether it's Scrum or Kanban or a blend, and be doing them by the book. But if the work isn't broken down in a way that enables us to deliver incrementally, Agile practices won't fix that. And so I like to spend a lot of times with teams focusing on how do we break our work down in a way that will enable us to deliver incrementally and without dependencies. And I think a lot of that starts with things like story mapping at a very high level and pulling the team into the conversation so they can see that big picture view of where we're trying to go with what we're trying to deliver. Breaking epics out in a way where from your story map, then you can break those epics into smaller deliverables that the team is working towards, and then making sure that those stories are following the invest criteria. So I think that is so important in a Kanban system. And for a lot of teams, they'll find that their stories get slightly bigger when we're doing Kanban, or slightly longer. Because we want them to be independently testable and independently deployable so that they can go all the way to production without waiting for other stories.
I'm going to hijack for a second. So when you did this talk at Lean Agile US, I was asking you about so you talk about having the teams do story mapping, and then you talk about just in time, and then the epics and the to-do column is part of your WIP. And it felt confusing to me,
yeah.
Well, if they're doing story mapping, that's kind of increasing their WIP, right? Because they're focusing on this bigger thing. So how do teams manage that when they work with you? How do you help them?
So I'll give you two answers here. So the first part is I like to manage everything through an enterprise level Kanban system where epics come in very loosely defined, just with basically the name of the story that came out of story mapping. And as they get closer, as the epic level gets closer to being pulled into the team, then the team does story writing right before they're going to work on it. And that helps for a lot of reasons, like I was talking about with kind of the more you know, right? If I'm doing definition of the stories right before I pull that epic in, I have new information because I've been doing development on this project, or maybe new technology has changed the direction or the way I would implement it. So we end up with better stories that way. We also end up with the people doing the work, writing the stories. So a lot of times when we try to define a lot of work up front, by the time the team goes to pull it, the team is a different team, or people have come and gone, and they weren't part of writing those stories, and we have to backtrack through all of them and review them and essentially end up rewriting them anyway. So I like to try to manage all of that through an epic level Kanban board so that the team is doing that definition just in time, right before they pull the work in. The other piece of that, when we think about all of those extracurricular activities, right? Those don't need to get tracked on your Kanban board. So things like meetings, things like design conversations, that typically doesn't get tracked in a ticket on your board, but is absolutely reflected in your cycle time. And that's one of the reasons that estimating with cycle time can be such a powerful tool. So I'm going to give you guys one last example story to keep in your back pocket. But if I was to ask everybody on this call, how long would it take to paint your bathroom? You might tell me it would, well, I don't know, there's 4 walls, but one's a door and one's a shower, so probably 2 days. I'm like, okay, great, go paint the bathroom. And you're gonna get in there and then you're gonna be like, I have to take the medicine cabinet off the wall, I have to take the shower curtain down, I have to tape all these tiny corners around the tub. And it's actually gonna take you 4 days now to get all of that work done and have the bathroom painted. Well, the same thing happens when we ask a room full of developers, how long will this take? They're just thinking about the painting. They're not thinking about the deploy work, the test work, taping all the tiny corners around the tub. So we only get a slice of the work when we ask them for the estimate. When we use cycle time to forecast when something's going to be done, we get all of that baked in. So things like taking the team off to do story mapping, or having them review work that's coming in, or sit in retrospectives, right? All of these things, that time is accounted for in our cycle time metrics. So when we forecast from that, we're getting a lot more accurate forecasts for dates.
Awesome. All right. I think we probably have enough time for one more question, and then Heidi, I think you're going to close this up after that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the last question, how do you assess what is the next most valuable item to be pulled in, and how do you mitigate the business issue of everything being equally valuable? So that's another whole day topic, but have at it.
Yeah. No, and I think your Kanban system can be very valuable in bringing visibility into those trade-offs, right? If you've got WIP limits in place, and then can say whatever the next highest priority item is, if it's, is it more important than something that's already on this board, or does it go into the to-do column? I think it's super important. You only have one to-do column. Your work should only appear in one board, even if it's coming from multiple different requesters or different product owners or different parts of the business. All of it funnels through one to-do column. So you only have one number one priority. And there's lots of different variations, like you're saying, of ways to prioritize, whether it's weighted shortest job first, or RICE, or HIPPO, highest paid person's opinion. Whatever your prioritization flavor is, it's that it all goes through that one column, so that you're not dealing with multiple number one priorities.
Awesome. Cool. Awesome questions, everybody. Thank you. Heidi, do you want to go ahead and wrap us up?
Thank you so much for joining today. It's been really awesome. And thanks, Colleen, again for joining. And everybody else, I think we had like 70 or 71 participants. So please head on to the Coaching Agile Journey site, register for John Cutler's open talk on product development, agile product development. And I pasted a Slido link so you can vote up on his questions that you would like John to answer. So there are some questions there already, and please add any ones that you have. And if you haven't heard of John Cutler or met him in some way, go head on over to Twitter. He's got amazing stories on Twitter, and post stuff on Medium and LinkedIn and Twitter all the time. So I encourage you to check John Cutler out. And Colleen, thank you so much for your amazing session. It was so great.
Thank you.
We have amazing speakers coming up, so follow Coaching Agile Journeys on Twitter. And yeah, thanks everybody. And the recording will be up along with the slides on our website, and you can check out our past events there too. So we'd love to hear about the value that we provided you. So tweet at us and send us little notes. We'd like to hear that we're making a difference.
Awesome. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
That's a wrap. Thank you so much, Colleen.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Colleen.
Thanks.